that, done with that. So we can get that all going. Okay, we'll get out of the way here.
All right.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
All right, we'll get out of the way. We're just piddling.
No problem. Hey, Bill, how's it going?
Hi, Benjamin.
Getting some people in here. All right. There's Brandon. Hey, Brandon.
Hey.
All right.
Stand up and make sure you got you when you stand up, then you're. Oh, it's just a webinar day. Okay, so you don't have to worry about all that. All right, fair enough.
No playing today. You're off the hook. But
All right.
to play in front of all these strings. That's the best part. Let's see here.
You're locked and loaded.
Got that going. I got a bunch of tech stuff that's getting all messy here. I think I got it though.
Oops. Here and there.
All right, so got Raza here. Cool. Got a few people in here. That's great. I think I've got a few that are watching the live stream on the website. I think I finally got that working. It's amazing, these things that I can do that I never thought I'd do. So today we're just going to do kind of a basic kind of studio class. And this is something that we have an opportunity to do in the summer because I'm not teaching my normal load. And I feel like I have all sorts of time to do that. And as we'll talk about today, really, I probably should be practicing, but I thought this would be a good thing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mute everyone. And then if you've got a question or if you've got something that you want to say, you should have controls. I think I made all this live so that you should be able to like raise your hand through Zoom, or if you just actually physically raise your hand, I will notice that and I'll give you a shout out and unmute you. So for now, I'm just going to mute everybody. Oops. And that should be a pretty good place to start. Everybody can hear me. Give me a thumbs up. All right. Awesome. Cool. So today we're going to talk about practicing and a number of the things that go along with practicing actually have to go along with kind of building some sort of daily routine for yourself or creating some sort of schedule for yourself, essentially. And probably most of us have talked about that at some point or another with some of your lessons or some of the other things that we talked about before. But I think it's worth thinking about really carefully. This is something that I kind of go over usually like the second week of every semester, the fall semester, the spring semester, and then right about this time of the year during the summer, because I want to make sure that whatever schedule that I'm in at that time, I'm actually getting the things done that I want to get done. And so I think one of the things, like I said, one of the big components is actually scheduling. We're not going to talk about that part today, though. We're going to talk about some other things. So I'm going to pull up and screen share a document with everybody that I just kind of threw together. It's got some information in it, some pretty general information in it about practicing and some guidelines or some ideas about how to do this. Now I'm going to post this on my website on the blog with today's information. So if you can't keep track of all of it or you're trying to take notes, it will be posted. So you should be able to see all of this stuff eventually for yourselves. I've got a bunch of text up here at the beginning that doesn't really matter. But one of the big things that I like to point out about practicing for everyone, just so that we're all aware of it, and maybe we'll play the raise your hand game here in a second, but practicing is not easy for anyone. And so if you can take away this concept that I'm the only one that struggles with this, or I'm the only one that sometimes wants to go do other things, that's probably not true. And you should eliminate that from your inner dialogue for sure. There's definitely different awarenesses of practicing that happen for all of us at different points in our actual practice session or even over the course of our day. So an example of that would be, I find that I'm actually able to be detail oriented and get a lot of good high quality practice done very quickly in the morning. So I don't know if it's a coffee thing or if it's just nothing else is quite started yet and I'm not getting a lot of emails in my inbox. But if I start practicing right around 7 or 7:15, especially like in the summer, during the year, it's a little earlier than that. But I can actually get a lot more done very quickly. So 15 or 20 or even 30 minutes of practice at that hour equals much more work accomplished for myself. So that's one thing about scheduling that I did think I wanted to bring up. Like I say here, we all get worked into careless routine. And I put a couple of examples up here that I hope are not true, but sometimes it happens. I was doing some research on some of these routine ideas the other day, and there's a psychologist that researches what humans do when they fall into routine. And there's some pretty incredible things that we do. One of them being a lot of people brush their teeth for not very long at all. The psychologist actually found that a lot of people brush their teeth for less than 10 seconds a day, which seems kind of incredible to me, but I don't know. So that's a good question to ask ourselves, I guess. The other thing that the psychologist brought up was that we've got these recommendations out for washing our hands for a certain amount of seconds, and there's all these songs that we can sing to go along with that. But most of us just wash our hands for an average of 4 seconds every time we wash our hands, which isn't long enough to get rid of some of these viruses that we're dealing with now. But her point was that we just get into these routines, and it's really hard to, move away from that routine. So what I would offer is that all of us think about what we want our practice to really be like every time we actually practice, what our goals are, and how we're going to organize those goals. And then we can move away from just having the routine of practicing and actually move into having some actual goals accomplished through our practice. So I think that the big thing that I wanted to point out today is some tools that I actually have available to all of you that you can use, or you can create your own tools to use this stuff. But I think it's important to make some really good decisions to help out with all of this practice stuff and organization of your practice time. So I'll show you a few organizers, but the first thing I want to say is, when you're getting ready to practice, you really want to ask yourself, what do I intend to accomplish today? And that's a really broad question for most of us most days, because we have this long list of things that we have to do. Mostly it's lists of things that I give you, but most of you also during a normal school year have band that you need to practice for, jazz band. Sometimes there's marching band on top of that. Some of us have orchestra or youth orchestra that we're getting ready for. Sometimes there's gigs. So the long list of things that you need to be doing in a given day and practicing in a given week can get pretty overwhelming. And so I think a really important thing is to make a list. And some of us, that needs to be a physical list. I have to have physical lists, even on my computer. Somehow it's not real if it's on the computer. So I've got to write down all these lists, and they're in this notebook. I should show you real quick. Hang on. So this is the master list for this week, right? So I'm old school and I write it down on a piece of paper in a notebook. But I've got all these different groupings for myself on the different things that I need to be practicing. I've got, several groupings for etudes I need to learn. I've got a couple groupings for duets that I need to learn for overdubs with students. I've got some orchestra music that's for next fall that I wanted to start working on. And then I've got this big long list of stuff that I need to start working on for some recitals that I'm hopefully giving next year. So organizing all those things out for me is really important physically out. Some people can write them on their laptop or their tablet device, and some people would rather have them just in their head, and that's fine. Whatever works for you. But I would say try something and see what you can accomplish with that. Then you have to get to this idea of, okay, I'm in the practice session now. And we've all talked about having multiple practice sessions in a day and trying to keep those shorter. I like 20 or 25 minutes typically, and actually having some goals for that actual practice session. And so that's where things can kind of get tricky, because it's pretty easy to say, I need to practice my etude for next week. but it's pretty difficult to say, I need to practice my etude for next week, and this is the rhythm that I'm not playing right, or these are the notes that are not in tune. Because that means you have to remember from the last time you practiced what you didn't like about your performance of that etude. So that's another place where taking some notes at the end of a practice session come in handy so that you know what you need to work on next time, instead of playing through that whole etude at the beginning of each practice session saying, well, those same things aren't working very well. I guess I'll work on one of them, working on one of them, and then forgetting about it until the next time you start to practice. Not that that's why we all do it, but that's something that does happen to a lot of us. So I think it's also important to plan out how you plan to accomplish your goals. So if I'm struggling with the rhythm of a certain excerpt or a certain etude, then I need to not only know that I'm struggling with that rhythm. So for example, I'm playing Tyrell number 3, which is an etude that a lot of my freshmen play. And I know that I'm not playing the dotted 8th note, 16th note rhythms correctly. So not only do I need to say, I need to practice that dotted 8th, 16th note correctly and get it fixed, but I also need to have an idea of what I want to do in order to fix it. And that's where things get a little tricky for all of us. And hopefully that's my job as a teacher, is to provide you with different ideas on how to fix it. And you may be able to develop your own ways at some point that really work for you. What you should find when you walk into the practice room is that you kind of have some concepts of what you want to do for this. It shouldn't just be kind of a blank slate of, well, I guess I'll just play through the pile of music, and when I'm done playing through the pile of music, I'm done, right? If you're really going to get things done. So that's kind of the thing about planning. And I want to show you just a few of these organizers that I've got. They're kind of down here. I didn't want to insert them, but this one's the wrong way. Make this a little smaller for you. So this one is called the daily practice block. And so these are kind of the main blocks I like to think about when I'm actually practicing. And I'll make it just a little bigger so you can read some of those things. So there's a number of things on here, and these may not apply to everyone every time. It's possible that every day you don't go through all of these blocks. But the main one here that I've got that most of us should probably do every day is our daily routine. And I just kind of listed out a few of the things that may include. And I also list out kind of the baseline of minutes that may be. Now I say 25 to 40 minutes. I've recently been trying to keep my daily routine just a little shorter than that. So maybe like 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes if I'm also reading the newspaper at the same time. But I think we can get too ingrained in doing that daily routine for too long. Some of these timings, just so everybody knows, they're based on if you're in college majoring in music, and that's not everybody right now. So don't always worry about the time. Less time is sometimes okay. So one thing that I do like to point out in daily routine is improvisation is a big part of my daily routine. So some of you, we might be working on some jazz improv. It doesn't always have to be jazz improv. It could just be improvising over a scale. So if you're working on a scale, you're working on your A major scale right now, you may also want to just mess around with creating a melody off of the A major scale. Or if you don't feel very creative that day and don't want to write your own melody, that's me sometimes, just play a melody that you know, but play it in A major because that's the scale that you're playing today. So, and it could get as simple as I'm going to play Mary Had a Little Lamb in A major, or you could get as complicated as saying, well, I really like this song from the radio, so I'm going to play that in A major. I'm going to play the hook from that. So that's one thing about daily routine. I think just to kind of quickly go over these other sections, you've got your scale and technical studies, and for me, that's kind of involved with the daily routine anymore. But you can drag that out, especially if you're working on your scales a lot for lessons. There's a sight reading section. I think the sight reading is really important to do every day, and I'm not always great about bringing that up in lessons, but that's something that I've decided that I'm going to try to be pushing a little bit more this summer. So that's just something to be aware of. Sight reading every day, man, it can be one of those things where you're just like, well, I don't know what to sight read, but All of us have pages in the back of a book, or the front of a book for that matter, that we've never played before. So just pick a page and pick a phrase if you don't have a lot of time, or pick the first half of that tune and just blow it down and see what you can do with it. And it's okay if it's a complete disaster. The point is you got to do it every day. And there's a bunch of stuff online. I've also been using the sight reading. There's a couple sight reading tools online that I'll be sharing with everybody this summer, and those are pretty cool. So the other smaller sections of my practice day, there might be some listening or score study. Again, that's probably mostly for the college students, but if you're really working on a solo or something, you may need to do some listening, maybe some YouTube videos, checking those out. That's definitely part of your practice. And it doesn't have to be split out as its own individual thing. You may be doing it as you're working on something, and that's fine too, but it's definitely part of your practice. Of course, there's always the cool down, which is another thing that I'm really great at ignoring. But I like to do a few long tones at the end of the day, some slow slurs, maybe some low range studies, stuff like that, just to kind of get myself settled and out of my practice kind of tense feelings, and just to kind of relax my mind a little bit too at the end of the day and know that I've got a plan for the next day. Sometimes that's the hardest thing. And then, of course, instrument maintenance is also part of your basic day and the things that you've got to do. So making sure you've got your slide lubed up and your valve oil and all that stuff. So that's kind of the smaller parts of my practice. Now, a big part of my practice is usually the music that I have to do. And I like to break that into different sections. So if in a normal semester, I'm getting ready for solo recitals, so that might be a big chunk of music. The orchestra stuff that I know that I've got coming up for the season, that might be a chunk. And then any other gigs, sometimes our chamber music for brass quintet, stuff like that. And so I break it up into different pieces, and I may not do all of that every week. In a normal semester, our brass quintet rehearses on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 7:30 in the morning. So that means on Monday evening and Wednesday evening, I need to make sure that I go over my brass quintet music so that it's in tip-top shape for rehearsal. And maybe sometimes on the weekend I'll look at some of it, but that's about it for brass quintet. So I'm not spending hours and hours on my brass quintet music. I'm just spending a little bit of time a couple times a week. I've listed out all the different things that this might be, and then there's some other ideas about how to practice that, and we'll work on fixing that. But you know, the big question that you always have to ask yourself is, what am I not accomplishing in this music right now, and how am I going to fix it? So that's one of the organizers. This one's not as applicable to this, but it was in the same PDF. So I've got some lesson and practice notes. And sometimes it's good, again, to take some notes at the end of each week, or at the end of the lesson, or at the end of your actual practice sessions, and just remind yourself of what you need to be actually working on. And again, this is something that you could just put on your phone, or it's something that you could actually print off and write on every week. But this is just another tool for that, and organizing all those different pieces of your actual practice. So then this is the big one, the weekly practice goals. I think having 5 big goals for a week is pretty doable for most of us. So this week, my 5 goals were a little embarrassing. No, they weren't. One of my 5 goals was I really needed to work on my flexibility from the 7th partial into the 8th partial into the 9th partial. So I turned that into a lip slur, and I turned it into a lip slur working out of different positions. So I was working mostly out in 7th, 6th, and 5th position, my outer position stuff. I turned those lip slurs into articulation studies as well, because I was concerned about the flexibility based on my articulation use. So that was one thing that I also did to help out with that. So you can create different studies for what you're actually working on. Another really big goal of mine was getting into the low partial on my tenor trombone. So I was having some issues getting into the first partial in the valve. So pedal F, E, E flat. And so I kind of took that apart, and I just decided that I was going to set my timer, and at the end of every practice session, I was going to work on those pedal tones in that range on the valve for 4 minutes, because I found that if I didn't give myself kind of a time, beginning and ending time, then I would just spend a lot of time on that and be totally worn out by working in the low range and wouldn't get anything else done. So having those goals and then also having some times associated with those goals are really useful. This organizer also gives you a place for goals for the month. And those are bigger goals that maybe will take more kind of broken up, individualized practice. And that's something that we sometimes talk about in lessons. It's like, what's your monthly goal? Or how do you expect to get this really big thing broken up into pieces over the course of the month? And then I've got things broken up by the day. And this is kind of what we were talking about. This is actually more meant to be a chart of charting your actual practice. So like today's Wednesday. So on Wednesday, I started at 7:15 to 7:45, and I did my daily routine. So that's what I would write there. And then on my comments on my daily routine, I would say my ninth partial was still not very flexible. Okay, so I know that I need to keep working on that for the next time. Then I had another chunk of practice from 9 until 9:30, and I was working on some duets that I'm going to perform in October, hopefully. And the big problem with those was some of the low stuff going into the low partial on the bass trombone. So you can use this any way you want, but this is just kind of an outline, basic outline on that. So that's a lot of stuff about organizing your practice session. I think kind of the next thing that we can talk about that's not so much about organization, but also has a lot more to do with kind of the internal self is how do you actually approach these goals with a mind space that's open and able to learn something new. So I think, like I'd mentioned before, it's important to have these goals, but it's really important to stay positive with the goals. So being negative, especially if you're writing your goals down and being like, man, I'm really, really bad at my entire solo. Well, that's not a useful thing to be thinking for any of us. So instead of using the negative terminology for ourselves, and this is hard as a teacher too, but instead of saying, well, you're out of tune and you don't sound very good, it's better to say, this is working, and I think this could work better, especially if these two things are working together. That would be more interesting for me to listen to, or however you want to phrase it. But that positivity or that kind of mindset flip is really important, because if you're going to practice for X number of minutes a day, that means that you could be getting negative on yourself for, up to 60, 120 minutes every day, just being really negative and grumpy. And that's not good. So that's something to be thinking about as well, is how can you actually approach something with a positive spin? And that's not to say that you don't listen to yourself when you're practicing and go, that needs to be fixed. But it is to say that rather than saying, that sounded awful, Benjamin, do it again, you need to say, that wasn't what I wanted. How can I make it better? It's kind of like a yes and improv sort of thing, except better. So again, try to remove all your feelings of emotion about yourself or what you're doing, and try to make the spin be more about what you're going to fix and how you're going to fix it. And I think that's really useful. That also has something to do, this is just a little side note that I probably shouldn't bring up in this studio class, but that also has to do a little bit with anytime you're thinking about any sort of performance anxiety or being nervous to play in front of people. The thing that you really have to remember is that you have to remove all that emotional content from what you're doing and just play the music that you're playing. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially if you're used to practicing with that emotional content. So it's another reason to remove it and just turn it into more of a exercise in fixing the problem. So we talked a little bit about the blocks of time and creating all the things that you need to do and getting those done in a day or within your practice session. I think one other point that I wanted to make on the daily practice blocks and how I've created that flow chart is it may turn out that there are certain days that you don't do all of those things. There are days especially when things get really, really crazy at work, that basically my practice is my routine. That happens once in a while, and then there's a lot of performance associated with that. But if I do my routine, I'll be okay. There are other weeks when a lot of what I'm doing is just the basic routine and sight reading, because I just don't have the capacity to address some of the other things that I need to address. So you do need to be thinking about, do you have capacity to address the project at hand? It's a little bit, if I can use a house analogy or a construction analogy, it's a little bit like when you start working on a home renovation project, and then you uncover the fact that there's this whole other bigger problem that's causing the problem that you're trying to fix. And so the question is, do you continue to fix the problem, the original problem, or do you set everything down and try to fix the new problem? And do you have everything to fix the new problem? And what I've found is that usually what you have to do is replan and readdress things. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. So that's something to think about when you're practicing as well. I think all of this kind of comes together with take notes. Help yourself remember what you need to do, but to put a positive spin on it, also help yourself remember what's been accomplished. And that's pretty tricky sometimes when we're in the practice session and we're feeling like we've got a lot of things that we need to learn really quick, especially if the lesson's tomorrow, right? But I think it is important to turn it around once in a while and look back on a week, look back on a day, look back on the month, or even look back on the year, and really remember what things are working for you and what's getting better. It's not that you always need a pat on your back or that you need to feel better about what you're doing, but it is important that if you're going to be really successful at the next step, the next thing that you want to do, then you really do need to have an idea of where you've come from. And that's easy to forget or lose track of. So I've shown you kind of all of these different practice techniques and ideas and ways of taking notes. There's some other tools that I think are really important as we're going through some of these ideas. So it's really important to have a metronome so that you're keeping time and so that you're playing the correct rhythms. Along with that, it's important to have a tuner. And often when we talk about using a tuner, we talk about using the visual tuner that shows you if you're flat or sharp. But what usually goes along with a good tuner, in my opinion, is drones. And there's a number of good drone sources out there, or usually most tuners anymore have some sort of built-in drone. And if you can find a drone that's playing in your range, that's the easiest. So you can really check your intonation that way. So that's a really great tool. Sometimes a mirror is really useful. Some of you have worked on some things where we've actually addressed some of the setup, your posture. Sometimes we're dealing with embouchure things when using a mirror is really useful. So I think having a mirror around is good. I also think having a mirror on the stand, like one of the small shaving mirrors, just a little flat mirror, is just a good reminder to keep yourself in the moment. To remember that this is you that's doing this practice, and it's not some sort of external thing. It's really you doing this, and that's a whole other side note about a mirror from kind of the normal practice thing. To go along with that, video recording is really important, or just recording in general. Listening to yourself is very important. I'm going to go back into the gallery view real quick, but can anybody raise their hand that says that they really love to record themselves and listen back to it? No one. Right? And I mean, it's really true. It's just not super pleasant to listen to ourselves because we hear all those things that we were working on. And even when we execute them, sometimes we go, oh, but it didn't sound easy or whatever. And so that experience of having to go back and listen to yourself is really difficult. But it's a really important and unique one that we're all really lucky. And I mean, it sounds very old fashioned, but in this day and age, we're really lucky we can do it. We can do that easily. And the really cool thing about recording on our phones, video recording or audio recording on our phones, is when it sounds bad, we can just delete it and it's gone. I love that. For whatever reason, when I was in college, I had a good number of cassette tapes and then mini discs that I recorded on. And I thought it was really important to keep all of those cassette tapes and mini discs. And now I feel like it's really silly if I throw them all away. So I've been listening to some of them and they sound bad and I wish I could just delete. So that's a really nice thing. If it doesn't sound good, just delete it and try again. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of your practicing is envision your performance of what you're doing. And it may be that it's just you're envisioning your lesson with me, or it may be that you're envisioning playing this for somebody who you want to play for, your family, your friends, that sort of thing. But if you envision what that feels like, sometimes that can up the ante a little bit and make you just a little bit nervous, which may help you perform at a higher level, or B, it can actually bring on some of those feelings of stage anxiety or performance anxiety and just remind you what that's going to feel like so that you can practice performing through that. So it's one of those practice tools that we don't talk a lot about typically, but sometimes it can be helpful to think a little bit more about what that performance is actually going to be like. So the last big thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of practicing today is kind of your order of thinking about things when you are practicing. And it's time, and it's being in tune, and then it's your tone. So I think in that order, that's the biggest stuff. So when you have something that's new, make sure you're playing the right rhythm. And that goes all the way down to checking the rhythm by clapping it or even saying it. It depends on what kind of school of thought you came from in terms of how you learn rhythm, but making sure that you're playing the rhythm or thinking through the rhythm. Sometimes it's away from the horn is really important. And then when it comes to intonation, like I said, I think drones are really kind of the way to go. So check your intonation with a drone. The simplest way of doing that would be setting your drone to the note that the key of what you're playing is in, and playing along with that drone. And when things don't sound quite right, checking your intonation. But a more detailed approach would be looking through each phrase, looking through each mini phrase, and making sure that you're really playing in tune throughout that phrase. Some of the more advanced intonation tools now, the drones, you can set specific intervals. So if you know that you've got a measure that's dealing with diminished seventh chords, you can actually set the diminished seventh chord and you can play through it with the drone. It's very useful and it's a really nice tool. So for intonation, there's lots of different ways that you can really make sure that you're playing in tune. What goes along with playing in tune is listening to recordings and playing along with recordings. And that's something that gets kind of ignored sometimes, but I think that's a really useful tool. So if you're working on a solo, it's a great thing to say, oh, I'm working on the Saratsky Concertino, and there's this great recording of Joe Alessi. Play along with it, and then you're just playing with Joe, right? If you're working on your orchestral excerpts and you want to make sure that you're playing your orchestral excerpts right, the easiest way to do that is just go through your excerpts playing along with them. That's actually, for me, some of the most fun. When I want to play, but I don't want to play what I should be working on. I love to pull up some of my favorite excerpts and my favorite symphony and just play along with them. And then I feel like I'm there playing. And then kind of this third final thing, tone. Another great tool for working on your tone is playing with recordings and listening to recordings. I think, the basic tone building tools that we use are playing on your mouthpiece, buzzing on your mouthpiece, buzzing on a cutaway mouthpiece is a really good one. Sometimes using your Portex instrumentometer, one of these guys, when you're working on making sure that you're really using the right amount of air. And then generally going back to recording. And if you record yourself and check your tone, that's a really good tool. So those are kind of that's my hierarchy when I'm practicing, is like, am I getting these three things right? And then everything else seems to fall into place after that. So again, these are just some organizational charts. And then I wanted to go over one last little thing before we hit some questions. Practicing scales. Scales can be, for lack of a better way of saying it, pretty boring to practice sometimes, right? Because we're basically practicing, typically, at least when we're in high school and college, we're practicing the scales for something so that we can get something. So you're either practicing your scales so that you can level up in all state auditions, or so that you can get a chair placement that you like, or in college it's so you can get through certain jury levels and move on with your degree plan. But the real reason we work on scales, and the real important thing about scales, is they teach us so much about our instrument. Again, it goes back to intonation. There's lots of intonation things that become very clear when you're working on your scales, things that you have to fix in terms of partials on the horn, sharp and flat partials. The other thing that scales really help us out with is articulation through different ranges. And that's something that I forget to talk about often. But if you're working on a multiple octave scale and you're starting down in the second partial on the horn and going all the way up to the eighth partial of the horn, you're working through a lot of different range articulating notes. And that practice can be very useful for your sight reading. It's actually kind of one of the big things about sight reading. So one thing that I always mention to people is, if you find that you're fracking a lot of notes, or you find that you have some inaccuracy with your articulation or your buzz in different ranges, keep working on your scales in those ranges, because the scales are a really good way of figuring out exactly where all those things have to meet: your airstream column width and airstream speed, your embouchure resistance to that, where the mouthpiece needs to be, if the tongue's in the wrong place in the oral cavity. And that's very, very useful thing. So just a couple of little things about scales and how to practice them to keep things interesting. So you got to find all the positions. And I think the easiest way to do this is just by saying the note name and going to the position. I'm playing a B flat major scale. It's really important for me to say B flat first, C sixth, D fourth, E flat third. And saying that out loud may make you sound a little crazy when you're practicing, especially at home. But it's a really good thing for you mentally to know exactly what the note name and the slide position is, and then also where that slide position is on the horn. It's another good thing that you can do when you're working on your partials. So that's kind of the first thing that I like to say, and I think that really helps. I like to talk about the expanding scale, or the pyramid scale. You can start with one note, then you play to the second note, back to the first, so forth. It's kind of like this. And probably most of you have worked on this with me, but working on that is really useful. For one thing, you're working on both ascending and descending on the scale. That's a big deal for most of us. You know, we often are very good at ascending up a scale, and then descending gets pretty messy. So we want to make sure that you're always practicing that as well. You can do your whole steps and your half steps separately. So that's a practice pattern by just making sure you understand the intervals that are in the scale. That's a really great technique, especially if you're starting to work on some of your advanced scales, your pentatonic scales, your whole tone scales, your blues scales, stuff like that. And then working with both just intonation and equal temperament. So I think probably with most of you, we have not talked a lot about all of this, but just intonation is the tuning system that most of us are using when we're working with a drone in your lessons, or when we're working with intonation in lessons. And then equal temperament is the intonation system that we're using when we play with piano. So the piano is an acoustic instrument that can't be perfectly in tune. And so they actually equal out the intonation across the lowest notes to the highest notes of the piano strings. So if you've ever noticed that it sounds pretty good when you're playing in a practice room, but then when you put your piece together with the piano, it sounds a little out of tune. So there's a reason for that. And so it's good to practice your scales with both just intonation, either a drone, using other trombonists around you, other instrumentalists, or also with a piano. And you don't have to have a lot of great piano skills to be able to plug a scale out on a piano keyboard and play along with it. Or you could find somebody who is a pretty good keyboardist and hire them, bribe them to play scales with you. That's actually how I got practice as well. So got a couple questions. Bill, you got a question? Oops, there we go.
Hey, Benjamin, I just want to mention, I think that microphone is timed out again. It's starting to get a little bit vibration or something in it.
Thanks. Is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
How long did I ignore you?
Only about a minute.
Oh.
I didn't want to interrupt your point.
Thanks. Appreciate it. So, essentially, there's a lot of different ways of practicing your scales. And I think that's a pretty useful way as well, is actually working with a keyboard. And some of you, we've actually gone over this. I've got Jude's actually he's in the live stream right now, but Jude and I were working on buzzing with the keyboard today, and he doesn't have a keyboard at his apartment or a piano. Fancy that, no piano in his apartment. Anyway, but there's some pretty good keyboard apps for tablets and your phone and stuff. And most of those apps, you got to check, but most of those apps come in equal temperament. So you can actually play through the keyboard in equal temperament on the app and buzz along with it. So that's a pretty cool technique that helps a lot, especially with scales, but you could do that with just about anything. So that's a lot of stuff about practicing that I just talked through. Like I said, I'm going to post that PDF up on my blog and make it so that it's a downloadable file that should be up tomorrow at some point. Just in case not everybody's been over to the blog, I'll just show some of that stuff to you real quick. Well, this is our live stream. Everybody wave. Oh wait, it's going to be too far behind. Oh well. Anyway, so if you just head over to my website, which is benjaminYatesTrombone.com, and then head to the blog, it'll be in here somewhere, and you'll actually, this is coming out hopefully by the end of the week, but I'll actually have a little bit better organization of all that. But you can hop through all this stuff. There's some pretty fun stuff in here. If you're having some specific troubles and you want some ideas about how to work through some different stuff. So that's probably worth everybody's time to check out and see how that's going. So I'll open it up real quick. Does anybody have any questions or any comments that they want to throw out there about practicing? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. Nothing. It must be a really, really good webinar. Cool. So if you've got anything that you want to follow up with me this week, if your lesson's still yet this week or next week, make a note of it or drop me an email, and I'm happy to talk through anything with any of you. Next week for the Summer Lessons webinar, what I want to do is I'm going to go over a couple other things that are practice related and show you a couple techniques. But I also wonder if we couldn't fire up some of the more kind of studio class related stuff and have a couple people perform for us, and we'll all give them some comments. So I may be reaching out to a few of you to see if you'd be interested in playing for studio class. There's no major pressure. You don't have to. It's not a requirement, but I think it might be kind of fun. So watch for that. And then eventually we'll get through just about everybody that's enrolled in Summer Lessons, and we'll give everybody a shot at this. But I'll give a couple people that have some more experience first, so they won't be as nervous. And I guess real quick, I'll just go through the people that are in the actual Zoom. This is the order I've got people in anyway. Hey, Charles, you want to wave to everybody and say hey? That's Charles. Charles is just finishing 6th grade, correct? Yes, excellent. And he just picked up a sweet Con 88H, and he's been practicing real hard. So Charles is killing it. That's pretty fun. Then I've got Bill down here. Bill, you want to wave? Cool. Bill's been taking lessons 2 years now, almost 3 years. Cool. And getting back at it. Played with the LSU Tiger Band and all that good stuff. So it's good to have you here, Bill. Thanks. I've got Brandon over here. Wait, Brandon. Yeah. Brandon's the incoming tenor trombone grad student with the University of Louisiana. So we were really excited to have Brandon coming in. He just finished at Southeastern, and he's got a pretty sweet alto trombone. that he's going to kill it on. Right? So that's pretty exciting. Good to have you here. I've got Elias over here. Hey, Elias. Hey. Let's see. Finishing up your sophomore year at Southside. Okay, cool. Excellent. And he's pretty excited to be heading over to the Interlochen summer camp this summer, which will be virtual, unfortunately. Sorry. But still pretty sweet. He's going to play with some great players and have some pretty great experiences. So that's exciting. Big thumbs up. And then we've got Rasa over here. Hey, Rasa. How's it going? Finishing your sophomore year at Lafayette High School? Okay, cool. Man, I'm getting them good today. And playing euphonium in the band, and hopefully we got some marching band going on this fall, and we're going to do some all-state audition stuff, right? Sweet. Cool. So good to have you all in the Zoom today. We'll have a few more people next week, and we'll just kind of keep checking in once in a while like this, and we'll be doing a little bit more playing. So it should be pretty fun. So it's great to have everyone. Thanks so much for joining me for this first one. It's a little different than our normal get-together sort of thing, but I think it's probably good for us all to put a few faces with the names that we're hearing and have a chance to check everything out. So next week we'll have a little bit more information, but it'll be less than this, and we will get into some playing. I'm looking forward to it. So thanks again, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.